Howdy, everybody. How you doing out there? Still not too hot, but it's going to get hot this weekend. 107 for the next week. Summer's not here yet, but it's coming. Hope you're trying to stay cool. Hope you're doing something cool. Hope you're listening to music. Hope you're passionate about something because that is what's going to make you get through this whole thing we call life is your passion. If you have some sort of whatever it may be. Creative passion, that's what I deal in. Yes, there's passionate people who like to go camping in nature and fishing and all that. I am talking about that's all cool. That's great. But what we're dealing with here in this class is the passion of artists to create and what they did to help shape who we are, and they're still shaping who we are by commenting on is one of those that everybody could share in. You don't have to go to a museum. You don't have to travel to a far off country to see it. Um, just put your headphones on and go. It's there. Now it's at your fingertips. Maybe you guys like to listen to vinyl. Do you like vinyl? It's kind of a hassle group with vinyl. And we liked CDs when they came out, then they're kind of cold. They weren't as fun as vinyl. And then that became passe. Then we were all downloading our music, which is quick and speedy. But the romance of the vinyl was gone. There's nothing, not even the credits. When you're downloading things, you don't know who played the bass on what track. You Google all that. That's fine. But in the old days, it was on a record of vinyl, and have all this information on this thing you could hold in your lap as you got your headphones on and rocking out to Jimi Hendrix or whatever, whomever you want to walk out to. Okay. So if you noticed, I made an assignment. SA3 is up on the board. So please, 11:59 p.m. That's 1 minute to 12. Nighttime, p.m. Night, 11:59 p.m. That's when it's due. But it's open right now. Please don't rush it. Please don't wait to the last minute. You'll be late, and I knock off points for being late, and it becomes a hassle for everybody. Concerning the other essays that I just finished, I forgot everybody's. If I didn't, you got to give me a shout out. I searched everywhere for more essays. I didn't find any. So if if you didn't receive a grade on the essay, but you handed one in somewhere somehow, you've got to reach out to me. You know how to do that. Thanks. Keep up on your journals. Keep saying it every week, but a lot of people get caught up in the journals at the very last minute. They try to rush through it, and it's usually a failure. So, your journal this week would start off with music and the documentary and the history of music by BBC, and then the history of the blues, which I put on there yesterday, and then stuff I'm going to put on there today. Um, Rock and roll, jazz, genres. Every art form has a genre. We like to categorize things, and that's essentially means what that is. Categorize. Um, and what kind of music you like? There's a ton out there, and now there's so many categories of, let's say, heavy metal. I can't keep up with the death metal, blah blah metal, this metal, that metal, speed metal, rap, blah blah. It gets kind of ridiculous after a while. The subcategories, but we're going to deal with some generalities, and the people I want you to look at and to research for your paper usually are were like innovators in their genres. I put up six of them there, I believe, and each one of them has huge important part in history of who we are in this country. Now, all these, except for Mozart, is 20th century Well, they're all 20th century. Anyway, so look at Mozart. You've seen maybe the documentary I posted, and when you look at him, why he was definitely a boy genius. I mean, you can't say that many people were writing symphonies at 4 years old. Uh, he was kind of a brat. He was kind of a punk. He was, but he wrote some of the most brilliant music of our times. And we're still playing his music. He died young. A lot of people in those days died young because they don't have the antibiotics and the penicillin we have now. And a lot of people died of consumption in those days. It was a common lung disease that is very curable now, but was not curable then. And so he lived literally fast and died young and left a good looking corpse, as they say. I don't know what his corpse looks like. So, anyway, so look at Mozart. Why does he matter? If that's what you want to write your paper about, if you're a classical music fan, there's so many more classical musicians. A whole semester on classical music alone, and we would cover all of them from Mozart to Beethoven to contemporary people like John Williams, who does movie soundtracks, and you know who that guy is, right? From Star Trek. Would you consider that classical music? That's an interesting question, actually. Um, they're symphonies. He uses the same instruments as Mozart did, just new with pop sensibility. Is it any less classical? Does it have to be boring to be classical? I don't think so. Um, there's some great stuff out there, innovative composers, but we tend to constantly go back to the same old, tried and true composers, just like in opera and in ballet. How many times are they going to trot out the same Swan Lake uh, and Nutcracker? Those are perennials, but there must be some new ballets out there. Yes, there are. Anyway, same with classical music. People like to hear the tried and true, just like when you go to your concert, favorite person, whoever you want to hear them play the hits. Then there's some people who they try to keep their artistic integrity and they don't want to play the hits like a jukebox. They want to play the new stuff. And you pay your $100 ticket to see whomever, and it's a bunch of new stuff you've never heard of. Do you feel ripped off, or do you feel like you've been exposed to something inspiring? We all want to hear what we want to hear. We like these people because of the sounds they make, and we want to hear those classical coming out of them. So people listen to Mozart for the same reason. So when you're looking at Mozart, don't just give me the copy and paste job from Wikipedia. Please no Wikipedia. Go deeper. Why did he matter? Not how old he was or when he died. That's okay, but why he mattered was the music. You need to write about the music, not just about his shenanigans or who he married or that's not why it matters. Music that's lasting. Okay, then we move on to posted a blues documentary on there I think yesterday. I'd love to watch the whole thing, but that's just part one. That'll give you a taste of the blues, where it comes from, why it matters, why it still matters, uh, and it comes out of slave culture in this country. And the blues, it's called the blues because people feel blue, depressed, or down. You start drinking or drugging because you got the blues. You know what I'm talking about. If not, I'm sorry. I'm glad for you. But some of us have the blues a lot, and it's comforting to listen to the blues. It makes you feel better. It's somebody playing and singing rudimentary lyrics and chords about the human condition that's down and out. That's not high society rich living in a penthouse in New York City. It's living in a cabin in Mississippi along a river and not much to do besides drink and have affairs with your neighbors and raise a couple kids that maybe you don't like, and you're kind of stuck. And so the blues is the perfect music to kind of heal your wounds. And one of the great blues artists of all time, Muddy Waters, is one I've chosen. Yes, I could have chosen 100 others, from Robert Johnson to Elmore to Elmore James and Talon Wolf, Mississippi John Hurt. There's so many of them. Muddy Waters got popular in his lifetime with the rock and roll crowd because he started to play in rock and roll clubs. He's a Chicago bluesman, and so his blues is electric blues, meaning it's not back porch swamp blues like Robert Johnson would be. He is playing electric instruments, and so that the rock and roll crowd related to that because that's what they like: electric instruments, electric guitars, drums, bass, piano, organ, saxophone. And Muddy Waters was a revolutionary figure, and he lived well into the 20th century and understood how popular he was towards the end, especially with a young white audience. You'll have to figure that one out yourself. I went to many, many concerts at the Fillmore in the day in San Francisco, and they always had blues artists on there: Freddie King, B.B. King, Albert King, Muddy Waters, and the white predominance loved it. Not a lot of African Americans in the audience. Jimi Hendrix, another black genius performer, was predominantly popular in the white audience. That's interesting. It's an interesting phenomenon. He wasn't popular, he, in the inner city black audience that followed Motown. Um, I think it's because they thought he was playing perhaps too white man's music, maybe the way he played, the way he dressed, the way his sound was. It wasn't soul, it wasn't rhythm and blues, although it's blues based. Um, but Muddy Waters had a huge white following who saw the his contribution to the music of their lives, and and how important and meaningful it was. And blues lyrics are always so human. They're writing about real things, and a lot of it's not happy things, but the blues makes it better. So Muddy Waters is hugely important. So there's one you could pick. Um, Woody Guthrie is a folk musician, artist. I'm not sure if I put him in there or not. This list looks longer. Uh, anyway, I talk about Woody Guthrie. He was folk music, I would say. Folk. What is folk music? Well, it's telling a story around campfires. It's telling the human interest a story in a straightforward manner. Woody Guthrie wrote some amazing songs like "This Land Is Your Land" and many others. And he was an itinerant farm worker who had a guitar and played everywhere he could. He was popular during the Depression era of the 1930s, and his music rang out. He was a unionist. He wanted, and so he showed up at union organizations where farm growers were unionizing, so they weren't being treated poorly by management. He was with auto workers were being poorly treated, and so a lot of times he got arrested a lot. He was a protest singer. That's another word for what he was doing. And people like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan followed that through with their protest singing, um, protesting about the government, Big Brother, bad bosses, bad marriages, bad wages, bad luck, drug addiction, alcoholism. Folk music covers it all, just like the blues does. And so he's an important figure. Yes, I could have picked other folk musicians from Mary to the Kingston Trio to Bob Dylan, but I wanted to pick kind of the granddaddy, the godfather, if you will, of the folk scene that so many people like Joan Baez and Judy Collins and Joni Mitchell and on and on and on were influenced by Woody Guthrie. His son is still alive. His son Arthur Guthrie is still playing out there. He's must be in his mid 70s now. He's been playing forever. He played at Woodstock, by the way, 1969. Anyway, so there's a legacy of Americanness in Woody Guthrie that you will find in really, it's authentic in no other music. Okay, then we're moving on to the late 40s and 50s. Jazz is a form of music that started at the turn of the 20th century, and it was instrumental music. Predominantly, there are jazz singers, absolutely, but Miles Davis wasn't a singer. He played the trumpet, and he had come up as an African American male, pretty brutal life, and the trumpet saved him. And he wrote some of the coolest, groundbreaking jazz ever with small combos. This was in big bands. These are 4 or 5 pieces: piano, drums, upright bass, saxophone, bass, and Miles on trumpet. And so he hit his stride in the late 40s and early 50s, where he recorded some revolutionary albums. One of them be, um, why can't I think of the first one? It's his most famous one. I'm drawing a blank now. Uh, Almost Blue. Do I have that title right? That can't be right. But and it's not frantic jazz. It's soulful jazz, melodic, soulful, melancholy. Um, and when he did that album with his quartet of musicians, um, it was a revolution. Coming at a time during post World War II, and blacks were still not giving equal treatment with civil rights. That wasn't happening yet. They're still getting crappy treatment in the South and other places. They couldn't play, or they couldn't stay in the same hotels. They couldn't use the same restrooms as white people. And Miles's music reflected that, but he had a cause to him, music, because he's that good. And it was his way of fighting against the status quo, which was the white world that was trying to control everybody besides, themselves. Um, yeah, so Miles discovered and brought up other musicians uh, that he played with saxophone. The John Coltrane. Miles lived a bit till the late 80s. He embraced rock and roll. He embraced what they call jazz fusion. And he was playing with young musicians when he died. Um, he was always expanding and changing. Why does he matter? Was he a nice person? Not really. I read his book that he wrote. He seemed like a He didn't like white. I don't blame him, but he didn't like them. But he contributed. He worked with some white musicians, so the racism tag doesn't quite play out. It's just that he didn't like working with people who were trying to make him their slaves. Who would? So Miles is really, really important. So when you look at Miles, look at the music. Look at the music. That's all I could say. That's why he matters. Anyway, I'll on these things so you can see them. Hope you watch them. I can make you watch them, but if you're gonna write your paper, you better watch it. Then we got the '60s, and I got to put the Beatles in there. No, I don't. Oh, this is my other list. This is not my list. Ah, that's funny. That's my old list. That's why this seems weird to me. This is my original list. I took the Beatles out of there because they're too popular. Beatles changed everything, but there was other bands that changed everything too, but they were never as popular. And I wanted you guys to write about that band. And here's another thing I changed. I see that. Okay, then the rest is the same. Okay. So I chose for the '60s a band that maybe you never heard of, except for through maybe Van Halen or something. They're called the Kinks. They were a British band, came in that first British invasion of America. That's what they called it. The Beatles, Stones, the Animals, um, Dave Clark Five, Herman's Hermits, and the Kinks, folks. The Kinks sang very uh, English music. They weren't kowtowing to American audiences. Ray Davies, who's still alive, and I've seen them many times, sings about an England that doesn't exist anymore, England of his childhood. And so there's a melancholy, nostalgic look at an England that doesn't exist. Maybe it should, but anymore. And his popular songs, You Really Got Me, which is really hugely famous by Van Halen. And until the end of the day, Lola, he writes a song, Lola, maybe you've heard it on the radio. They played it a million times. Essentially, he goes into a bar. There's a beautiful woman there. He's flirting with her. He's going to go home with her folks. Turns out that Lola is a man. And he knows that. And he goes, oh, well. And it was a revolution because he's saying essentially, oh, well, I'm going home with him, whether it's a man or not. And so it's a wonderful song. He had hits. They had hits, not huge hits like the Beatles. Maybe you've heard some of his songs. He perhaps wrote one of the most wonderful songs in history of songwriting called Waterloo Sunset that even the Beatles would envy. Um, Sunny Afternoon, so many others. But Waterloo Sunset alone gets him on the genius level. And he's still producing music. He's still out there well into his 70s now. And so I put the King had the following the Beatles did, and they had the, you know, they were a different sort of band, and they played to somebody who wasn't handsome or popular in school. And so that's why my brothers and I related to them so much. We related, it was hard to relate to the Beatles because they were like perfect. They're cute and funny and talented, and they got everything they wanted. We like the Rolling Stones better, cute or funny, and they were singing. And but then the Kings came in and spoke to us in a way that I've never gone look back. I put the Kings up there higher than those other bands. Love the other bands though. Don't get me wrong. Anyway, so that's another one. So that's the '60s. I'm doing going through each decade here, folks. Muddy Waters would be the early 1900s. Um, Miles Davis would be the '50s, '60s, Kings. And in the '70s, yes, there was huge bands in the '70s like Led Zeppelin and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and yes, and David Bowie, who I love. But I wanted to focus on the late '60s, '70s when disco Mania swept the country, and bands like the Bee Gees and Casey and the Sunshine Band were producing happy, happy, happy dance music, which frankly I hated because it just wasn't. I wasn't relating to it at all, and so this thing came around, started by the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, all punk rock, and that was saved the day for people like me. And uh, um, out of the New York scene, English scene had the Sex Pistols, the Clash, so many Buzzcocks, the Slits, the Raincoats. Um, Post punk was huge. You know, that would be the Boy George and so many other, the Smiths, great, great, great bands. Anyway, but I'm talking about this specific time in the punk rock um, area. There was very few women. There were some women. The Slits was. I mean, come on, guys. They're called the Slits. Do I have to explain to you? Um, and they didn't ever play in America, I don't believe. But they had a pretty good following in England. And then, of course, Chrissy Hynde and Pretenders became huge. But that's because she was punk in her heart, but she was pretty and sexy. And so everybody wanted to look at her. And there were other bands like that too, like Blondie was led by Deborah Harry, but wouldn't really call it punk. Um, yes, absolutely. They're famous for them. Deborah Harry's still out there performing. Um, but I wanted to concentrate on Patti Smith, who was a poet, lived in New Jersey, moved to Manhattan, lived with Robert Mapplethorpe, the famous controversial gay photographer who, if you've seen his photographs, I dare you to look at them. Uh, it's all online, folks. They're graphic sexual bondage that make people uncomfortable. He got famous off those. She was roommate. They were lovers at first, but then he preferred men, and so they were roommates for several years. And she had some famous affairs with people like the right. She was backed up by Lenny Kaye, the guitar player, and then all of a sudden they became a full on band. And she put out the revolutionary album called Horses in 1975, and it changed the universe, folks. And I'm not exaggerating. What is she singing about? Edgy stuff. And if you think punk rock is just loud guitars with people screaming over the vocals, think again. Because punk has nothing to do with the sound, it's about the attitude. And so look at Patti Smith, go deep on her. She's still out there. In fact, I'm going to see her in September. She's still performing. I've seen her several times. But other bands, television, Talking Heads, they all came out of, yes, you don't think Talking Heads is punk? They were. They were considered punk. They didn't sound punk. They punk. They looked like college yuppies. But it was their attitude, and they fit right into the scene in New York where they all played at this nightclub called CBGB in the Bowery. The Ramones played there. They're a fixture there. And in England, the punk rock scene was huge, led by the Sex Pistols and the Clash and those other bands I mentioned. And it was based on something else. In New York, it was more of a creative art scene. In England, it was definitely politics. The Clash and Sex Pistols were railing against unemployment, um, whereas the New York punk scene was more personally creative, pointed. They're expressing their personal wants, desires, hopes, and dreams. Patti Smith is hugely important. Go deep. I wasn't happy with the 80s. There's some great bands in the 80s, like uh, Radio came out in the 80s, REM and Great bands like Husker Du and Replacements got really huge in the 80s because of college radio. That was huge. I can't go into all of it. It's just too long. I've already spoke for 30 minutes. I'm going to wind this down. I got two more bands to talk about that I want you guys to look at. Nirvana would be one of them. They started this thing. They call it grunge. Started in Seattle. Grunge bands were Soundgarden, Alice in Chains. Some great bands. In my opinion, the last great rock and roll genre came out of Seattle in the grunge scene. And Kurt Cobain led the way with Nirvana. Kurt was a tortured artist who loved the Beatles as much as he loved Black Sabbath. And his songs embraced both of those. And Patti Smith, and the Buzzcocks, and the Clash, he had a way to incorporate all his influences into heavy music, dark music, but with a lot of melody. He had a great singing voice. Guy always was suicidal, and finally at 27 years old, he blew his brains out with a shotgun right in the middle of his fame. 27 years old. The tragedy of Kurt Cobain is still felt. Hip hop world is starting. It's really started in the 80s. It was some different urban artists, and it was their version of punk rock. It really was. How can they, meaning the African American community, participate with their own style of music and rapping, which was essentially what it was called in early days. And one of the great true pioneers of who had a smart band and just wasn't singing about getting rich or getting sex with a bunch of women like some of the rap bands did. They're called the Wu-Tang Clan, and they were an organization, 5-6 guys that really had put a serious stamp on hip hop in the early 90s, and made rapping and slam poetry and the sounds of the city and the streets and DJ sound, electronic sound come alive, and they're just as revolutionary as Patti Smith, the Beatles, and Nirvana, absolutely. So those are the ones you could choose to write about. Check it out. Post some more documentaries. Please look at them, even if you're not going to write about that artist. Check those documentaries out. You won't regret it. And read chapter 9. I'll talk about that next time. See you next time.